Now, when you're placing objects onto your report or into your main work area, you're going to be either placing them using absolute positioning or relative positioning. Absolute positioning, also known as specific layouting, is where you're defining the X and Y coordinates in relation to its parent object or parent container. With absolute positioning, you're telling me exactly where you want it to appear on the report. You're placing an object and you're saying it needs to be at this location where I'm specifying the X and the Y. Siblings don't influence the position. You may end up with overlaying objects if you position them in the same place, but absolute positioning means you are telling the report writer exactly where you want this object to go. And when you drag and drop, when you just click on an item and drag and drop it across, you are using absolute positioning. Alternatively, you can use relative positioning. Relative positioning is also known as dynamic layouting, and that's where you're not defining the X and Y coordinates. Instead, the object is going to be positioned relative to its siblings inside of its parent container. So the elder sibling sizes are going to influence its position, the sibling order is going to influence position, and where the parent's object influences the position of the object's eldest sibling. Relative positioning is frequently used when you're designing a list or a row of data where you want one field to immediately follow the preceding field within that parent container. So if that preceding field size changes, you then want this sibling, the relatively positioned sibling, to move out a little to make room for that elder sibling's size change. If you want to use relative positioning, you're going to hold down the control key while you drag and drop the item from either the toolbox or from the data view onto your work area. We also have the concept of mixed positioning. If it's mixed, then one coordinate will be defined, but the other coordinate will always be relative to the siblings. I'm going to return to the concept of absolute versus relative positioning a few times within this module. This is probably one of the most important things for you to understand before you go out and start designing your reports. So to give an example here inside of our sample application, if I look at these items right here, you'll notice that they have green dots. The green dots means that they have been placed out there using relative positioning. However, other objects, when I click on them, I see they have a red dot. If there's a red dot, it means they have been placed out there using absolute positioning. I've given values to their X and Y axis. If I want to add a word box to this report, if I just grab the word box and drag it over, you'll see it has a red dot. Why? Because it's using absolute positioning, and where I drop it, that's exactly where it's going to stick. If, however, I hold down the control key and I drag this word box across, you can see that it uses a green dot. You can also see a red line appearing. That's letting me know what sibling it's going to be snapped to or relatively positioned by. And when I release it, it's then going to go and be placed relative to the field that I placed it next to. Once an item's been placed on a report, there's a few things you can do when you're manipulating this item. And what I want to talk about now are the squares that appear around the item when you select it and the little colored circle. The squares allow you to do resizing of this object. By clicking on it, you're going to see it change from having 8 squares to having 4 squares. If there's 8 squares, I can resize it to where it can stretch one direction or another direction. If there's only 4 squares, the resizing is always going to be proportional. You'll also notice that there's the colored circle, and the colored circle lets me know whether this object is absolute position, then it's red. If it's relative positioned, then it's green. Or if one coordinate is absolute while the other is relative, it's either yellow or blue. You can move this circle around the object to change where the attachment point is. So to show this in my report, let me expand the size a bit. One thing I have up here, I have this 4J's logo. You'll notice when I click once, I only have 4 squares. That means if I drag it, it's going to do my resizing proportionally. However, if I clicked again, I have 8 squares. Now I can drag it and it can stretch one way versus another. Also, I have my attachment point here. The fact that it's red means that my X and Y size have been specified. And I can look over and I can see they have been specified. They're saying 0, 0, which means on its parent, put it in the very upper left-hand corner. That's absolute positioning. I've told it exactly where I want it to be. I could take this red dot and I could move it around and change where the attachment point is. Right now I've moved my attachment point here. If I go and change my X and my Y back to be 0 and 0, you can see the attachment point has said exactly where it's going to be placing it, but because of where I had the attachment point, it's actually pushing this image off of my report. Let me go ahead and return that attachment point to where it was previously so that I have the logo where I expect it to be, and I'm going to go ahead and bring my logo back to its original size. When you select an item in the main work area, you're going to see a yellow rectangle appear around that item, and that's going to tell you what its parent object is. You're also going to see X and Y arrows appear for that object. And what this lets you know is the layout direction. Childs to this object will always be added in the direction of the green arrow, and the Y could be up and down, it could be left and right, that's different, or it could be right and left. That's all set by a property of that object. And the X is always going to be 90 degrees from Y, either clockwise or anti-clockwise. So for example, if I click on this 4J's logo, what you can see is my X is going from left to right and my Y is going from top to down. If I click on the parent container, my X was going top to down and the Y is going from left to right. I would expect, and now I can see down here, my layout direction is left to right. If I change it from left to right to make it right to left, what you'll notice is first my 4J's logo has been moved to the other side because now I say I want this children to be placed right to left. The second thing is you'll notice that my X arrow is now going down, up and down still. However, my Y arrow is now going from right over to left. Let me switch this back to left to right. The other thing you can see is anytime I select on an item, it's telling me, the yellow is telling me what its parent container is. When you right-click on an object in the main window, you're going to get a contextual menu appears that allows you to change a variety of things. You can change the width, the height, and the positioning attributes. You can select its ancestors or its descendant of the selected attributes, and you can change the type of object it is. If I right-click that same object in the structure view, there's only a few things that you're going to be allowed to do. You can rename the object, and you can change the object type. So let's go back to our Report Designer. If I go to my report structure, and lets me grab this report title, you'll notice if I right-click on the report title, I'm allowed to change its type, and I'm allowed to rename it. If instead I click on the item within my structure view, not only do I get to change the object type, but I can also go and say in the horizontal positioning, I could change its vertical positioning, align top, align bottom, make it fixed from top. I can change the width. Do I want to maximize the width? Do I want to use a value? Do I want to minimize the width? And a variety of other items. I promise you that we return to the concept of absolute versus relative positioning. And right now we're going to look at how we can drag and drop things across. One of the things I said earlier was that this is probably one of the first concepts that you need to grasp when you start using Report Writer is how am I positioning my items? Am I positioning them using absolute positioning? Am I positioning them using relative positioning? So when you drag and drop from the data view or from the toolbox into your main work area, when you drop the object onto another object, it's going to add it as a child of that object. And if you're doing it holding down the control key, it will use the relative positioning, where I use a red line to identify what elder sibling it's going to be positioned next to. If I drag and drop without holding down the control key, it's going to use specific layouting, and small black lines are going to appear to give you what we call stickiness. And that's going to be helpful, for example, if you're doing a report that prints out to a form where you can align it relative to existing objects on that report. So let me return back to my Genero Studio interface. Let's say that I want to put a word box into my report title. I'm not holding down the control key. When I drag it across, I can see the red dot. And as I'm moving it around, I can see exactly where I'm going to drop it. Let me go ahead and draw another box now because I want to show you the lines that can appear. The black lines should appear there. It's letting me know, okay, if I drop it here, it's going to align to this other report object that I have, and that's what this black line is designed to do. Alternatively, I can use the control key, and when I'm dragging the item across, the little red line is telling me what is the object it's going to be placed next to. Like, for example, if I want to put it inside of my row here, I can see the red line telling me what its elder sibling would be, and when I drop it in, it places it next to that elder sibling, and we can see that up here. It placed the word box underneath the data.customer.store name, and it's now going to be relatively positioned against this object. If I looked at the properties, I would expect the X and Y to not be defined. An alternate to dragging and dropping into the main work area, you can also drag and drop into a structure view. Now, when you drop an object onto another object in the structure view, it will add it as the last child of that object using dynamic layouting. So if I have an element I want to add, for example, to a table row container, I can drop it onto that table row container in the structure view, and it'll make it the last child of that table row container. Once I'm in the structure view, I can rearrange things inside of that structure view. If I drop an object onto another object, it will add it as the last child of that object. If I hold the Alt key down while dropping it, it's going to make it the parent of the selected object. And finally, I can drag and drop it between objects to change its position within the sibling order or within the entire structure. So let me return to Genero Report Designer. I can go to my report structure, and here I have a table row. Let's say I wanted to add a field to this table row. I can go in my data view. I can find the field that I want to add. Let's say I want to add this quantity again. I can go and I can drop it on top of the table row. It adds it as the child of that table row. Now that I'm in the table row, I could go and let's say I wanted to drop it onto this order total stripe. I could drag it and drop it. It now becomes a child of that order total stripe. If I wanted to make it the parent of the order total stripe, I could hold down the Alt key, drop it on top of order total stripe, and now it is the parent of that order total stripe. Now that's something I don't want, and here we can see I want to move it out of where it's sitting right now. I can drag it, and you can see this small line appearing. The small line allows me to place it in between objects that already exist. I want it to be under the pre-order total separator, but at the same level. So I'm going to drag it, see the line appear, and drop it. Now it's placed this order total stripe back where it should be. I'm going to delete the quantity that we've just added. One very usable alternative to dragging and dropping is this drag and drop alternative. Now what I can do is I can select a report object in either my main workspace or in the report structure. I'm selecting the object that I know I want to be the parent. Once that object is selected, from my data view or from my toolbox, I can double click on an item, and that item will become the last child of the selected parent object. This object will always be placed using dynamic layouting if I'm using this drag and drop alternative. So to clarify, if I know I want to add something to the table row, instead of dragging it and dropping it onto that table row, I can just select that table row, I can double click on the item, and it's now positioned out there using relative positioning, placed as the child of that table row. When you're building list reports, you're going to find highlighting an item and doing a double click to add that item to it is a quick way to include a bunch of fields within that container. We give you the ability to use cut, copy, and paste on your report objects. Report objects can be copied and pasted within a report. They can also be copied from one report and added to another report. If you want to copy multiple objects, you can hold down the Control key while you select the objects before you do the copy or before you do the cut. When you move from one report to another, you may have to change variable names if you need them to differ between the source and the destination report. You can also delete a report object, but realize if you're deleting a report object, all child objects will also be deleted. So let's look at an example of this. If I go into Studio, let's say I wanted to use this report order total stripe. I wanted to copy it and paste it elsewhere inside of this report. I could right click and do a copy. I can identify where I want to place it, and I can right click and do a paste. You'll see that it's created a copy of it. You can see that it's added a 1 to it to give it a different name than what we created the copy from. If I wanted to copy multiple things, again, I could hold down the Control key, and that just allows me to select multiple things. And again, if I'm deleting an item, you'll notice if I delete this copy that I made, it's going to delete all the items that were underneath that as well in its hierarchy. Let's return to when we're dragging items out of either the data view or the toolbox and placing them onto our report. If we're dragging from the data view, I want to remind you that there are a series of icons across the top that will pre-populate certain properties based upon whether you want it to be a form item, whether you want it to be a table item if you're building a list style report, whether you want it to be a form label, whether you want it to be a table column header. These items, when you select them, are going to change certain properties to make them what we think you want them to be based upon whether they're going to be an item just sitting on a report or whether they're going to be part of a table row that's printing across. From the toolbox, we're going to put them all out there with the default settings. You're going to have to go in and edit any of the properties you need to provide values for that item you've placed on there, or to change its positioning, whatever it is you want to change in terms of the properties. Just to show quickly how this works, I'm going to go ahead and select my table row, and I'm going to first put out a form field value object of order num. I'm going to then put out a table field value object of order num, and then I'm going to put out a table header value of order num. Now, I typically wouldn't do this all within one container. I just wanted to show you some of the differences. For that first icon, when I clicked it, if I look at the properties, you can see that X size has nothing in it, and you can see the value is saying to go and grab this value from the row that's being put across. If I instead look at the next one, where I put it across as a table column value, this time it does have an X size, giving a formula that specifies what my maximum width of this field is going to be. However, down in the value, it's still populating with the value from the row that comes across. If I look at the third item, this was a table column header object. I expect my properties to have, again, a maximum size. How large do you want this table column header to possibly be? But this time, I also have a text provided. This text is specifying what the column header title is based upon of the XML data stream. So as you're positioning things out, or as you're dragging things out from the data view, you'll want to make sure that you select the appropriate icon. However, realize that if you don't select the appropriate icon, you could go in and manually change these properties to reflect what it is you want the properties of that object to actually be. I'm going to go ahead and delete these from my report before we move to the next step. Once again, we've talked about this before, but I can't emphasize this enough. If I'm dragging and dropping an item into the main window, by default, it's using specific layouting. However, if I wanted to use dynamic layouting or relative positioning, I need to hold down the Control key before I drag and drop. If I'm dragging and dropping into the structure view, it's always going to be relative positioning by default. And if I want it to become absolute positioning, I'm going to have to edit my X and Y properties to define what the absolute positioning is. Once an object is on my report, I can move that object around to reposition it on that report. Now, if you're working in the work area or you're working in the structure view, you of course can do drag and drop if you want to, and I would say this is not as frequent as dragging and dropping within the work area or the structure view, but I could go in and edit the properties view to say where I want that object to be. So I can select the object in the work area or the structure view, and then I can edit X and Y properties to position it in a different location. If I provide numeric values for my X and Y properties, I'm specifying an absolute position of where it needs to be on that report. If I want to make an object relative or using relative positioning, I click the default icon to remove the X and Y values, and then it becomes relative to its elder sibling.